Segment 3, the proprietor. A number of features appear again and again throughout your career. One is the impulse to build. When your father died and you took over the Adelaide News, one regional newspaper, within a few years, which is to say while you were still in your 20s, you purchased the Sunday Times in Perth. You purchased suburban and provincial newspapers in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, the Northern Territory, and you purchased the Daily Mirror in Sydney. Your father didn't do that sort of acquisitive building. You did in your 20s. Where did that come from? Where did that come from?
Well, he did. Well, of course, he was, I thought, a great man, but he had built a great newspaper group, if you like, but as an editor and then a managing editor and chief executive. He didn't own them. And that was in Melbourne. And I experienced that sort of life. Right. And couldn't imagine any other life as good as that, as running newspapers or being in that, so involved in current affairs and everything. And there I was in Little Adelaide, and with the Adelaide News, in an interesting and cheeky war against a much bigger paper. And we did buy some things, but they were all things that were going broke. And so we had to try and turn things around.
Was there a moment?
I mean, they were very opportunistic things in the effort to be bigger than just Adelaide.
So did you say to yourself, as a business matter, I have to build in order to continue competing in Australia? Or did you say to yourself, equity, I want to own properties?
No, in order to compete, because so much there was so little we could do just in Adelaide. You know, we were buying cartoons and stories, some features from bigger newspapers in bigger cities, and that was later my same motivation in television, from a little television station in Adelaide, having to take programs from bigger things. And then finally, when I got bigger, I found I had to take them from Hollywood, and it all led to me taking the opportunity, when it came, many years later, the opportunity to actually have a studio where you make your own product.
All right. I still think there's something exceptional there, even though to you it all felt like a natural progression. It's a striking progression.
Well, it was opportunistic, I think. It was like London. I'd worked as a cadet almost after I left Oxford for a year on the London Daily Express and just loved every minute of it and knew all the people there. And 15 years later, in the midst of coming to the end of a huge war of tabloids in Sydney, I couldn't understand how three of us could survive in Sydney, if only just, and there was only one in the whole of Britain.
Right.
So, I took the first opportunity to jump in there.
Here's another feature. You're leading to another feature of your career, which is taking on the establishment, taking on various establishments. You become proprietor of your father's paper, the Adelaide News, and the big newspaper in town, the Adelaide Advertiser, leans on you and sends your mother a letter pressuring her to sell to them. And what did then 24-year-old Rupert Murdoch do? He published the letter on the front page of the Adelaide News and started a circulation war with the Adelaide Advertiser and did pretty well out of it. Years later, you're in Britain. The Printers Union is choking the newspaper business in Britain. You secretly begin putting state-of-the-art printing presses in a warehouse in Wapping, an undistinguished suburb of London, and then you suddenly announce that you are moving the Times of London, this mythic property, from Fleet Street out to the warehouse in Wapping, and you just took them. In fact, you tell what happened as a result of that move. The unions did not like it, to put it mildly.
No, we had a horrible strike. We also had the London Sun in a different part, which was printing 4 million copies a day, and the Sun was much less. The Times, rather. The Sunday Times was a big property.
The Sun was, and I believe still remains, the biggest circulation English-language newspaper in the world. Is that not so?
Yes,
right.
Certainly.
All right.
And is doing still very, very well. But what happened was, the unions, I can't begin to describe, the old craft unions and how they behaved and continued to behave with all newspapers. There wasn't a newspaper that didn't lose an edition once a week or do something. Right. Or appear full of mistakes because people were fighting for anything. And the publishers would always get together once a week as they were going to stand together, and then before they got back to their offices, someone had broken down and given in. So I just waited until I thought I was big enough and strong enough. And things changed. We went out of a Labour government to a Conservative government, although we never had any contact or asked for any help. They automatically did at least protect us with a lot of police and so on. But yes, when the contracts came to an end, we presented them with a new contract, which we knew they would reject. So we just went on printing, but at a different place, and with different distribution over the whole country, which had been planned in great detail for a year. It was a huge operation, and very, very nasty, because we immediately had thousands of people at our front gates,
willing to work, willing to...
No.
The protesting, you mean?
Protesting.
Right.
Not
Right.
just
It
our
got
strikers,
violent.
but
It got violent.
it's amazing. In the middle of the 80s, it doesn't sound so long ago, but people like the Workers' Revolutionary Party, the Trotskyites or whatever, they all came out on a Saturday night and a Wednesday night. It was like a big night out for them. And the police would be there on their horses, and they'd be throwing darts into the back of the horses, who would rear up, and the television lights would come on. And what was really interesting was that major industrial figures, people like the head of ICI and so on, went on the BBC and said, this is not the British way to conduct relations. But we couldn't get to first base. Anyway, after a couple of weeks, I had a deal with the head of the union, secretly, and who was a very nice lady, and I never heard from her again. She couldn't sell it to the union at all. So they stayed out, and a year later, they settled that they'd never come back and take 1 week pay for every year they'd been working for me, and which was half of what I'd offered a year before, and that was it.
You took them on.
There's still a lot of bitterness around, but not much.
Right, right. You faced them down.
We faced them down, and it was, yes.
What establishment?
That was an epic battle. It was the first major in 50 years, or certainly 40 years, industrial dispute that had been won in Britain by a private employer.
I would argue that it teed up Mrs. Thatcher's battle, the decisive battle with the TUC over the coal mines.
It followed that.
It followed that.
It followed that.
Okay.
That was somewhat of a cue to me.
I see. All right. So what establishment are you taking on now?
Oh, nothing like that. But certainly, I would say the somewhat monolithic liberal press here. I can't buy any newspapers here. I can buy them any number for next to nothing. But my shareholders would be in revolt. Not that they can throw me out, but it would be very destructive of values. But no, we'll get there. And we believe by making far the best newspaper in this country, it will rub off onto others.
Is there room for two national newspapers in the United States?
There should be.
The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times?
Yes, well, the New York Times, we outsell it, outside of New York.
Yes.
We outsell the New York Times by about 3.5 to 1. In New York, they outsell us by about 2 to 1. So we're starting a new edition in New York with an extra 10 pages or so. I don't know how many pages, 8 or 10 pages of just New York
You just
news.
can't resist a fight.